Welcome to TDMG, Geopolitics Explained, where we discuss our rapidly changing world and what's happening in it. My name's Max.
And I am Heath.
And today we'll be covering the war in Ukraine, recent incursions by Russia into NATO airspace, and much more from the world of diplomacy. Stay tuned.
So do you want to run through the headlines, Max?
Sounds good. Well, recent headlines from the past week has been obviously UN General Assembly. That's been the largest event. The escalator and teleprompter fail, malfunction when it came to Trump. The White House and Secret Service are investigating claims that UN workers sabotaged it intentionally. They've found nothing yet. The other thing was Albanese. He went on a bunch of overseas visits in the past week or so. He went to New York for the UN General Assembly. He went to the UK to visit Keir Starmer, and he actually spoke at the UK Labour Party's conference in Liverpool, which has stirred up a bit of controversy. And
also met the King and saw the opposition leader. So
yes,
been quite busy.
And he stopped over in Abu Dhabi to meet with some leaders there to discuss trade deals. And another big piece of news for Albanese, and something that I think he'll be glad to get the media off his back about, is that he's got a meeting scheduled with Trump for October 20th in the Oval Office.
Oh, okay.
So that is a new development in Australian diplomacy.
Nice.
The war is ongoing in Ukraine, and also with Australia on the world stage. A couple of weeks ago, there was a deal that was announced between PNG and Australia. It was a defence deal. It included a bunch of groundbreaking things like a mutual defence pact, the so-called total integration of our militaries, recruitment and citizenship pathways for both ways. And this was supposed to be signed in the same week that PNG was celebrating its 50th anniversary of independence. But the PNG Prime Minister has said that his cabinet has yet to finally approve it. So that needs to happen. There's been some talk of interference by China. Nothing's confirmed on that front.
Or at least taking the opportunity to offer something during that period where they're sorting things out.
Definitely, yeah. And Australia has been spending a bunch of money on PNG defence bases, for example, a naval base on Manus Island in recent months. So Australia and PNG have been cooperating ever more closely, and it'll be interesting to see whether this specific deal gets over the line or not, but we'll leave that for later. And ongoing wars in Sudan and Myanmar, we won't be getting into those today, but in some future episode we probably will.
And of course there was also the development with the US announcing a potential peace plan with Israel that was issued to Hamas. And Hamas are now reviewing the deal. And I believe Benjamin Netanyahu said that if they do not agree to the terms of the deal, that they will continue relentlessly in their siege of Gaza.
And I believe Tony Blair, the former Labor Prime Minister of the UK, is said to be on the proposed council that will run Gaza in the aftermath of the war. It's interesting to see who will be on that council. Apparently it's going to be a mix of Palestinians and foreign experts, I think was the term they used. It'll be interesting to see how that's actually implemented, if it can be implemented, because obviously it takes two to tango. This specific plan will only work if Hamas also says that they're okay with it happening. Otherwise, as you said, Israel will continue its offensive in Gaza.
Before we continue though, I'd like to mention our monthly magazine Snapshots, which includes some of the most interesting and spicy stories which are a bit too hot for YouTube, which are available online and in print now. You can purchase it down the link below. Thank you.
So Max, do you want to talk about the major story for today, which is the war in Ukraine and how that's all going?
Yeah, so Heath, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a couple of big developments, not particularly like inside Ukraine in like the main battle theatre, but in terms of adjacent countries. So for those who don't know, and I'm sure a lot of people who are watching will know, NATO is a thing that exists. It is a military pact that involves the United States, Canada, and a bunch of European countries. And basically, the whole foundation of that is a few articles, and one of those articles says that if one of them is attacked, all of them are attacked. That's Article 5.
Yeah.
Anyway, in the last couple of weeks, Russia has violated, and by the statements of European leaders, it seems that they believe it was intentional, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it was intentional, that Russia has violated NATO airspace. So the first incident of this was on the 10th of September. So in the early morning, local time on 10th of September, several Russian drones entered Polish airspace during an attack, a drone attack on Ukraine. And those drones that entered, there were 19 or so, were shot down by Poland with the help of their NATO allies. This is the first time that this sort of thing has happened since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Obviously, there was the prior invasion of the Donbass and Crimea, but since the more recent invasion, 4 of the 19 were shot down, or at least 3, the estimates vary, but at least 3 were shot down by NATO, and the others, I believe, crash-landed harmlessly. Some of those came from Belarusian airspace. The Belarusians, Belarus is led by Alexander Lukashenko. He's a dictator. And Belarus claims that it helped shoot down some of those drones over its own territory, that it had nothing to do with it, and it's been really trying to wash its hands of this. And I think, do you want to talk about some of what the official NATO response has been to that specific incident?
Yep.
I know there's been Article 4 consultations activated. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, sure. So essentially Estonia activated Article 4 after the incursion. And you can think of that as essentially an emergency meeting between NATO countries regarding incursions, territorial integrity, political independence, or security matters of any member that is threatened. The incursion was part of a wider pattern of increasingly irresponsible Russian behaviour, according to NATO, and several other allies, including Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Norway, have also recently experienced airspace violations, according to NATO. They've expressed full solidarity with all those allies which airspace has been infringed upon. And in terms of the response, it's been kind of muted, but they have ramped things up slightly. So on September the 12th, they launched a thing called Eastern Sentry to bolster NATO's posture along its eastern flank. So they're pushing for a more general reinforcement of its eastern flank with an increased presence in air defence capabilities. So what we're probably looking at is directed energy weapons, laser systems, electronic warfare, and CRAM. And also some more older systems which were originally considered obsolete, such as SPAA, so that's self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, which have seen a resurgence due to the use of drones. And lastly, of course, the Allies said that they will not be deterred by the irresponsible acts from Russia and have continued their commitments in their support for Ukraine. And of course, they're putting their territorial integrity and security first. So yeah, that's pretty much all that's been developing so far.
Yeah. So thanks for that context, Heath. So yeah, as Heath was saying, this is one of those grey zone warfare type of incidents. The EU Foreign Policy Chief, Kaja Kallas, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, said that indications suggest that this was intentional and not accidental. Poland is actually pretty important for the war in Ukraine for supplying American and European equipment. It has obviously a land border with Ukraine. There's a lot of rail and logistics hubs and routes through there. And in response to the violation of Poland's airspace on September 10th, NATO began Operation Eastern Sentry, which has the goal of reinforcing the alliance's eastern borders by deploying additional air defence systems and military jets. That was the first incident, and
yes,
I did say earlier this has been quite a big month. Heath, do you want to talk us through the second incident that happened?
Well, the second incident happened with Romanian reports of kamikaze drones breaching its own airspace So that's a second incident on NATO countries. Romanian jet fighters were monitoring the area where there was Russian attacks near Ukraine, and they tracked the drones. And they were over about 20 kilometres southwest of a village called Chichila Veche. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But it was not an overly populated area.
So I believe, according to ABC News Australia, the drone it orbited for around 50 minutes, and it went from the northeast of that town, sort of down to the southwest of a larger town or city called Ismail. Those are both settlements along the Danube River, and for those who don't know, the Danube River is one of Europe's largest rivers. It goes from all the way up near Austria and Germany, and comes down through the Western Balkans and pops out in Romanian territory. So a bunch of people had things to say about this one. Zelensky said it was intentional and an obvious expansion of the war by Russia. Romania summoned the Russian ambassador, Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy chief. She said that this is, quote, yet another unacceptable breach of an EU member state's sovereignty. There was actually a new Romanian law that was passed earlier this year that would have authorised Romanian pilots to shoot down this drone, but they chose not to, based on considerations of what collateral damage would happen. I don't know exactly what happened with that, but the Romanian Defence Ministry, that's really the only statement they released. And they released that statement because within Romania there was a lot of media criticism of going, hey, there was a Russian drone, a kamikaze drone in our airspace for almost an hour, and you didn't shoot it down, and it was going like near populated areas. So what were you doing? But they didn't shoot it down. The Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that in Poland there's been preventative air operations begun with their allies, and that ground air defence has been set up, and it's in its highest state of readiness. So all along the eastern side of NATO, they're sort of on high alert now. In that same week that happened, that Romanian airspace violation, Trump said that he would be willing to sanction Russia further, but only if NATO countries did the same and did a bunch of other things like stopped buying Russian oil. This announcement by Trump was in the same week that Charlie Kirk was assassinated, so it didn't get as much media coverage as it probably would have. But then on September 14th, Czechia, the Czech Republic, sent a special operations helicopter unit to Poland. This is more and more equipment moving into the eastern side of NATO. And then the third major incident this month was on September 22nd. So about a week ago. NATO...
September 19th.
Oh, my apologies. Yes, you're correct. September 19th. There were 3 Russian MiG fighter jets that entered Estonian airspace, and Estonia is towards the north, in the northern half of NATO's Russian border. And 3 Russian fighter jets entered their airspace over the Gulf of Finland without permission, and they stayed there for 12 minutes in total. NATO, in response, they scrambled a bunch of fighter jets. They were Italian, Swedish and Finnish aircraft to respond to that. And the Estonian foreign minister was obviously not very happy about this. He said that this was, quote, unprecedentedly brazen, and that, quote, Russian fighter jets were seconds away from the capital of a NATO country. He's referring to Tallinn, the capital city of Estonia. The EU foreign policy chief, Kallas, who actually is a former Prime Minister of Estonia, said that this was a, quote, extremely dangerous provocation. Russia claims they didn't enter Estonian airspace and they followed a planned route from near the St. Petersburg area through to the Kaliningrad exclave, which is a Russian territory next to Poland and Lithuania. But the Western countries do not agree with that interpretation. This is the 4th violation, apparently, by Russia of Estonian airspace just this year, as well as the 3rd major incident this month. Estonia, in response, they asked NATO for extra air defence assistance over the Baltic Sea. And NATO also, on September 21st, so 2 days after this incident, they scrambled jets again in response to a Russian military plane flying in neutral airspace over the Baltic Sea. This is a pretty similar situation to some of the stuff that was happening during the Syrian civil war. In 2015, a Turkish fighter jet actually downed a Russian bomber after it warned it multiple times, and the Russian bomber failed to acknowledge those warnings and crossed into Turkish airspace from Syria. So this is informing part of the discussions about what to do in response to this, what is acceptable, what is going to, what would put NATO and Russia into World War III and what wouldn't, as well as what's an appropriate assertion of NATO sovereignty.
And I guess the Trump administration and the broader community's response has been kind of tapered. I know they're kind of in a tied up situation where they can't necessarily, retaliate to Russia's incursions as much, but they also can't necessarily sit back and just let things happen in Russia to continue to prod defences. The Trump administration, they've been very careful with some of the words that they're using and how they're addressing the situation, but overall they're condemning the incursions that have happened. Donald Trump on Truth Social on the 24th, he said, after getting to know and fully understand the Russia-Ukraine military and economic situation, and after seeing the economic trouble it is causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form.
And this is actually a pretty different stance to what he previously had. What was his sort of previous sentiments? Do you recall on this issue?
With his previous stances, Trump essentially just wanted the war to end. He didn't really care about winners or losers. He just wanted the war to be resolved as quickly as possible. And we kind of saw that in his first few weeks as presidency, his interest in trying to achieve that, but he struggled to obtain a meeting early on. In July, I believe it was August, they had the Alaska summit, but that fell through and didn't actually lead to much development. But Trump did say that it was a pathway to peace.
And in that same Truth Social post that you referenced, he called Russia a paper tiger.
Yes.
And he said that they'd been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years. There's a lot of sort of criticism of Russia and mocking even of Russia. He said it's a war that should have taken a real military power less than a week to win. So he's very much belittling Russia. And for people, regardless of whether they love or hate Trump, it's widely acknowledged that Trump respects strength. And that's, I guess, part of the reason that maybe, I don't want to say he's been friendly with Russia, but he certainly has been more tempered in his criticism of Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
And it seems that, yes, he cares about strength above maybe other things that people would value, like strength over the principles or the ethics of certain leaders. So the fact that Trump sees Russia as the weaker party or weaker than they should have been in this situation seems to indicate Trump's sentiments towards the whole situation are changing. So that'll be interesting to see with regard to US support in the future.
And also another thing is that Trump's more demonstrating with action rather than words this year. With the peace summit that they attempted to get through, they had a military display. I mean, the actual summit was on a military base. They had B-2 bombers flying over when Putin was there. And the US has, kind of tried to position itself and try and, take action and do things rather than say things. And by doing that, the US hopes that will be, a greater deterrence to, slow down Russia or at least stop Russia from progressing in the war, or at least bring it to the peace table, essentially.
And speaking about those actions that have happened, Trump and Zelensky met on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly on the 23rd of September, and it was interesting to see the sort of dynamics within that meeting. I'll return to the dynamics within that meeting in a second because I made some notes on that. Yep. But he said a couple of interesting things. He said there was a question from a reporter which said, "Do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian planes if they enter their airspace?" And Trump said yes. Mm-hmm. So that's very, I guess, pro-Europe or pro-Ukraine rhetoric from Trump. And the second question, which was a bit more telling, was, do you still trust Putin? To which Trump responded, "I'll let you know in about a month," which gives more of an indication that things are starting to change within American foreign policy circles. At that meeting that Trump and Zelensky had, it seems that Zelensky requested Tomahawk missiles from the US, and those missiles have about a 2,400 kilometre range, which means that the Ukrainians, if they got these, would be able to strike Moscow from Kyiv, which is a long way. And J.D. Vance, he was being interviewed on September 28th. He said that the White House is considering that request. And since August, the Trump administration, instead of selling weapons directly to Ukraine, because there's been a lot of opposition to that within the MAGA movement, they've sold weapons to Europe to give to Ukraine. So Europe pays for it. The US gives the weapons to Ukraine, and the Ukrainians can use them, which is a bit of a shift in the way that Ukraine's supplied.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there's been a bunch of statements from American officials. For example, the special envoy from the US to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, he said that there are, quote, "no such things as sanctuaries in war," and that Ukraine should have the ability to conduct long-range strikes on Russia. And when Keith Kellogg was asked about J.D. Vance's comments and Trump's comments, his interpretation was that they were encouraging Ukraine to do those strikes deeper into Russia, which, again, that's not Trump and Vance trying to play neutral third party anymore, as they were trying to earlier this year. It's them saying to Ukraine, attack him, hit him hard. Which, again, is a big shift. Coming back to the dynamics in that meeting, though, between Trump and Zelensky, I noted a few things down. Obviously, the most well-known meeting between Trump and Zelensky was in February of this year when there was that big kerfuffle in the Oval Office.
That's right.
One of the key sticking points with that was, according to Trump, that Zelensky wasn't wearing a suit. Now, in the meetings that they've had since then, Zelensky has worn suits, but he's worn very dark-coloured suits. So for this one, I had to look quite closely on the photo because it was hard to tell with the lighting. But Zelensky was wearing an all-black suit, black jacket, black pants, black shirt, black shoes. And to the cameras, unless you look very closely, it looks like he's in one of his dark-coloured military fatigues.
Yeah, that's right.
But in person, you would no doubt be able to tell that he's in a suit. So it's very interesting that he's got a... I'd be surprised if he didn't have a fashion designer or a fashion manager within his wardrobe. No, not within his wardrobe, within his team, telling him what sort of things to wear. Because, number one, this gives the impression to the general public in Ukraine and in the West that Ukraine is still a country at war and he's still a wartime leader and people should still be in a wartime mindset. But at the same time, in person, it's making Trump happy. I guess. It's making him at least not offended by whatever Zelensky is wearing. So it's an interesting little dynamic there. Also, Zelensky was copying Trump's posture a lot in the Oval Office meeting in February, when there were arguments between Zelensky and Vance and Zelensky and Trump. You could see Zelensky sort of sit back in his seat and cross his arms. But with this one, Zelensky was like leaning forward in the same way that Trump does and on the edge of his seat and sort of just having his hands together down at his knees, which is exactly what Trump was doing. You see a photo from that interview and they're doing pretty much exactly the same thing. And Zelensky was clearly more relaxed. And I don't think that's accidental. Zelensky was by trade an actor and a comedian. He knows how to, I guess, get on people's good side or how to act intentionally in a certain way. So I think this was an intentional move by Zelensky. So anyway, I just wanted to go into some of those dynamics from that meeting because I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, there was another thing that happened on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, which was that the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, said that, quote, NATO and the European Union want to declare, in fact, have already declared a real war on my country, that being Russia, and are directly participating in it. So the Russian Foreign Minister has essentially said that Russia and the West are at war. I mean, in the West, we'd sort of consider it a proxy war, but the Russian government's framing it as a sort of somewhere between a proxy war and a full-on World War III. Do you want to sort of explain some of the Russian mindset, give a bit of context on the Russian mindset for people?
For sure. Well, before we discuss the Russian mindset, we kind of need to understand history and go a little bit back to the relationship between the West and Russia. And I mean, this goes back over like almost 1,000 years, and we're not going to go that far today. But essentially, Russia has been invaded by the West in various forms, at least 7 times since the 1300s. And it's seen, I guess you could say, opposition from NATO back during the Cold War, from the Germans during World War II, Germans World War One, and of course Napoleon, just to mention some recent examples. If we talk about like NATO more specifically, though, that was formed in 1949 as part of the Truman Doctrine. So that was a policy of containment by the United States to prevent the spread of communism in Europe and abroad by the Soviet Union. And that policy of containment was targeted at the Soviet Union to stop it expanding. And, you know, since its inception, Russia's always perceived the alliance as a counterweight to a hostile force, essentially almost like a anti-Soviet pact. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the transpiration of what would be understood today as an anti-Russian pact, but with obviously more diverse capabilities. The Soviet Union attempted to join NATO during its founding, but its membership was rejected, which in a way has kind of proved that the alliance was against the Soviets. And as a result, they formed their own little group called the Warsaw Pact, so most of the Eastern European countries, which then formed the Iron Curtain in Europe that many people are aware of. And then during the reunification of Germany and the overall post-Cold War period, there was the so-called no-inch eastwards promise that was made between Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and US Secretary of State James Barker. And it essentially promised that NATO would not expand eastwards 1 more inch. However, that agreement was never put on paper. And of course, as we've seen, NATO has expanded to most of these eastern countries. It's interesting, though, because a lot of people, when they talk about the East-West relationship, they kind of talk about, before the Cold War, the more imperial era, the Cold War, communism versus capitalism, and then obviously the post-Cold War, where it's Russia versus Europe and the West. But we often miss out that transitionary period in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is important in this discussion. NATO actually tried to create or have constructive dialogue with Russia in that period. Boris Yeltsin was actually pro-Western and, sought economic reform, reform in the institutions, and was hoping for a more integrated relationship with NATO and potential membership. The NATO established their Partnership for Peace program, which aimed to build those closer ties. And it ultimately didn't resolve to much because of a combination of miscommunication, national interest from Russia, and of course NATO expanding eastwards to other countries without Russian consent, even though there was no agreement that required that. And, ever since NATO's intervention in Kosovo, and then of course the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, Russia has kind of felt betrayed by the West and backstabbed for all these encroachments and kind of violations, I guess you could say. And many analysts, such as George Kennan, argue that the West provided, if the West provided greater assurances and constructive dialogue, then we could have prevented the East-West divide that we're seeing today, and we could have seen a change in the role of NATO, essentially. But yeah, essentially the Russian mindset is to reclaim those Russian territories and to push out NATO. And essentially the Russian strategy has been to build buffer zones. You saw that with the Warsaw Pact. You're seeing this now with them trying to go into Ukraine. They've secured Belarus. They're trying to create buffers between Moscow and the east to prevent invasions. And yeah.
So thanks, Heath, for giving us some more insight into the Russian perspective on the current war and the geopolitical situation. I think I might just go through some final points on just general developments in the war in Ukraine. So one of the big themes of the last month has been Ukraine hitting Russian oil refineries. We actually have a map here that, if the editor can get on screen, that'd be awesome. There are a bunch of places where Ukraine has struck Russian oil and gas facilities. Refineries as well as petrol stations, I think, which has absolutely screwed with the Russian oil industry, and Russian petrol prices have gone through the roof. Even most Russians now, according to sources like Forbes, have noticed the increase in those prices, and that is no doubt having an impact on the support for the war among Russians, because a lot of the impacts so far have not been felt directly by them. The war has been many thousands of kilometres away, or many hundreds of kilometres away, actually, and they might know someone who's been killed in the war, but there's not really an economic pressure that's been applied to them. But this is quite a significant economic pressure, and the Russian economy in general is rumoured to not be doing well. One strike on an oil refinery, actually a petrol pumping station rather, in the last few days has been in a village called Konar, which is only 90 kilometres east of a city called Kazan. And for those who don't know Kazan, that's around 600 to 700 kilometres west of the capital, Moscow. It's a long way inside Russia. And that drone strike, halted operations at a petrol pumping station. There were no casualties, but it certainly wasn't ideal for the residents of that village. So petrol prices are going up, the economy's teetering on the edge, I think is fair to say, and everyday Russians are starting to feel the effects of this war. Also, there was a recent election in Moldova only yesterday, and I will get the article up for this. This is a bit of a late edition. It only came into the news yesterday. So Moldovans have voted for the Party of Action and Solidarity, which got 55 out of the 101 seats in Parliament in Moldova, which sets them on a more pro-EU path. So it'll be interesting to see how the developments in Moldova go. I know that there were some pro-Russian parties or organisations that were banned in the lead up to this election. I'm not sure exactly on what grounds, but they were banned.
National security
and
bans, I believe.
Security bans? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how Moldovan politics develops. Hopefully more in the pro-EU direction. But yeah.
Cool.
Anyway, I think that's generally
that's
it
all
for the episode.
Yep. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content that we provided today. Be sure to let us know how we went down in the comments, and be sure to check out some of our other bits of content that we've got going around here on the channel. So yeah, I'm Heath, and this is Max. Thank you for watching TDMG Geopolitics Explained, and we'll see you around next time. Bye. All right, good.